Hey there. I'm going to do my best today to walk you through the key elements of Iran's political regime, but I'm going to start with a warning and a suggestion. The warning is that this is a super complicated regime. It's often the most difficult for my students to fully understand. And the suggestion is that you can make it a little bit easier on yourself if you just abandon the idea that Iran's regime is going to fit very neatly into any of the conceptual buckets that you already know about. If you go through this lecture looking to say, oh, that's semi-presidential, or oh, that's a bicameral legislature, you're going to have some difficulty making the actual facts of Iran's constitution match up with what you know about those concepts, with those textbook definitions, because this is just a really, really unique arrangement of political institutions. I will do my best to make this make sense for you, but I think if you let go of that temptation to categorize Iran in those boxes, you will have a slightly easier time of this. So let's start with the backstory of the Constitution. Iran's Constitution is ratified in 1979 during the Islamic Revolution through a nationwide popular vote by really considerable elements, and it explicitly establishes the form of government in Iran as an Islamic republic. This is unique in the world. That idea of theocracy combined with some elements of republican democracy are both baked into the Constitution from its founding. The theoretical concept that tries to merge these two elements, that tries to make them make sense together, is known as jurist guardianship. This is developed by Ruhollah Khomeini during the 1970s. He's really the primary exponent of this idea, although there are plenty of other people who write about it as well. And it basically says the following. Number one, the idea of popular sovereignty is silly and in fact arrogant. God is the ultimate source of sovereignty. Religious law is the ultimately correct way to run a country. And therefore, you can't leave all political decisions to the people or their elected representatives. There have to be experts in Sharia, in Islamic law, who are there to guide political authority, to make sure that the decisions of political officials ultimately conform to the religiously correct path. That doesn't mean that clerics get to make 100% of the decisions. There is room in this philosophy for some degree of popular sovereignty, for some degree of electoral democracy, but the ultimate goal isn't to give the people what they want. There have to be constraints that ensure that the popular will is going to conform to Islamic law. And that will help, I think, understand, I hope that will help illustrate a number of the ways in which Iran's kind of dual theocratic and republican institutions are arranged and interact with each other. The executive branch is a good illustration of this because there are essentially two people who demonstrate those combined religious and secular functions. Religious authority is exercised in Iran by a person called the supreme leader. Secular authority is exercised by an elected president. Let's start with the supreme leader. This is one of those positions that is just absolutely unique to Iran. There really is not a very clear analog for it anywhere else in the AP CompGov course. Only two people have served as supreme leader of Iran since 1979, so we might as well name both of those. The first was Grand Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who serves for a decade from 1979 to 1989. You might remember he's really the figurehead he's really the face of the Iranian Revolution. There is basically no question that he is going to be the supreme leader when Iran's constitution is first ratified and creates that position. After Khomeini's death, he's succeeded by an Ayatollah named Ali Khamenei, who comes into power in 1989 and who is still in power as supreme leader as of this recording in August 2021. Just a note, by the way, on vocabulary. Ayatollah is a title of religious authority, maybe a loose equivalent in Catholicism is bishop. It's not a single individual. It's somewhat common to hear Western commentators refer to the Ayatollah as a shorthand for the supreme leader, but that's a little bit loose, and I don't recommend doing it because there are plenty of people in Iran with the rank of Ayatollah. Khamenei is not the only one. The powers of the supreme leader are pretty expansive, although mostly they are supposed to be kind of high-level powers rather than day-to-day governing powers. The supreme leader is the commander-in-chief of Iran's military. He is responsible for setting the political agenda and shaping the overall direction of policy in the country. That's not a formal power, but it is in effect what the supreme leader does. He also has some specific appointment powers. And by the way, I'm saying he because this office is restricted to men because of the religious qualifications attached to it. He can appoint appoint an institution called the Expediency Council. He appoints half of an institution called the Guardian Council, and he appoints the head of Iran's judiciary. And I'll say more about all three of those institutions in a little while. He also has some direct control over a number of state-owned economic assets, so he has significant resources at his disposal that he can use to dispense patronage and pursue his own agenda, even if the elected parts of the state aren't amenable to that. The Supreme Leader is selected by an 88-member body called the Assembly of Experts, whose basic function is to appoint and to supervise the Supreme Leader. In principle, the Assembly of Experts has the power to supervise and even to remove the Supreme Leader. In practice, they have absolutely never thought of doing this in Iran's post-revolutionary history. The Assembly of Experts has 88 members. They are directly elected, and there are religious qualifications for membership. Remember, this is an explicitly theocratic institution whose job is to select an explicitly theocratic leader. So there is actually a written test that candidates for the Assembly of Experts must pass demonstrating their qualifications based on their knowledge of Islamic law. The other half of Iran's executive is the president. The president is directly elected and limited to 2 4-year terms. So far should sound kind of familiar based on presidents that you know about. The president oversees the civil service, so this is more of a head of government responsibility than a head of state responsibility. But the president also leads Iran's foreign policy, at least in principle, although if there's a conflict about foreign policy direction between the president and the supreme leader, the president might not always get what they want. So we see here some blending of head of governments and head of state functions. You should not expect the president to fall neatly into either of those categories, and I'm going to avoid the temptation to classify it for you. The president also drafts the budget. In a true semi-presidential system, that would be the responsibility of a prime minister, a head of government, and can initiate legislation in Iran's legislature, the Majlis. Finally, the president can nominate members to the cabinet. They are subject to legislative approval. One important difference between the president of Iran and other presidents that you have previously heard about in this course is that this president has no veto power. That's going to be exercised by a different institution, which I will talk about when I get to the legislature right now. So technically speaking, Iran has a unicameral legislature, which is called the Majlis. Sometimes you'll see that spelled with an E instead of an A. There are 290 legislators in the Majlis. They are each directly elected to serve 4-year terms with no limit. And it has kind of standard legislative powers with some different constraints that you're used to hearing about. The Majlis can initiate and pass legislation. It has the power to oversee the budget proposed by the president. They have to approve the president's nominees for members of the cabinet, and they can hold votes of no confidence in members of the cabinet as well. One thing to note, and we'll probably talk more about this when we talk about social cleavages in Iran, is that there are 5 seats set aside in this body for members of some recognized religious minorities. So there's 3 for Christians, there's 1 for a Jewish representative, and there's 1 for a representative of Iran's Zoroastrian community. That's not all of the religious minorities in Iran, and in particular, you'll note that there's no set aside for Sunni Muslims, and there's also no set aside for Baha'is, which are the largest religious minority in Iran. But there is a concession to religious diversity in that structure. And so there are not the same qualifications for religious authority or religious training for membership in Majlis as there are for Iran's other theocratic institutions. I'm going to depart from our usual executive, legislative, judicial structure and try and turn to some quasi-legislative institutions. I'm not really comfortable classifying these as actual legislatures. Remember, Iran is formally unicameral, but they do serve a couple of legislative functions. So 2 bodies to talk about. The first is called the Guardian Council. This is arguably one of the more powerful bodies in Iran, although I'll give you some time in class to debate whether or not that's the case. The Guardian Council has 12 members. They serve staggered 6-year terms. 6 of those members are appointed directly by the Supreme Leader. The other 6 are appointed by the Chief Justice, the head of the Judiciary, and they must be approved. Those 6 must be approved by the Majlis. The Guardian Council's job is essentially to exercise that function of jurist guardianship that was articulated in the run-up to the revolution. So the Guardian Council reviews legislation to ensure that it's compatible with Islamic law, and they also vet candidates for elected office, and they actually do exercise this power pretty enthusiastically. There are some cycles in Iran where you'll see up to half of the candidates stricken off the ballot for the Majlis before the election is going to happen. There is a third body called the Expediency Council, whose function is basically to work out disputes between the Guardian Council and the Majlis. The Expediency Council has 88 members serving 5-year terms. They are all appointed by the Supreme Leader, and their function is to resolve any disputes that happen between the Majlis and the Guardian Council. So the Guardian Council, if the Majlis passes a piece of legislation and the Guardian Council says, we don't think this is compatible with Islamic law, they can send it back to the Majlis. The Majlis gets a chance to revise the legislation and then send it back to the Guardian Council for approval. But if they then say a second time, nope, this still doesn't meet our criteria, then the decision about what to do goes to the Expediency Council, and the Expediency Council has the final say on what's going to happen to that legislation. They can amend it and pass it through in a way that they hope will be satisfactory to both parties. So this is a unique kind of compromise body that emerged because there were increasing conflicts between the Majlis and the Guardian Council in terms of what legislation was actually compatible with Islamic law. Both of these institutions, not necessarily legislative bodies in themselves, but they exercise really significant checks on legislative independence in Iran. Finally, let's move to the judiciary. The judicial system, the legal system in Iran is based on Sharia, is based on Islamic law. And I want to make just a quick note about Sharia, because it's often been talked about in a really reductive way in American political discourse that I think will be unhelpful if you're trying to actually understand how Iran works. Sharia is a really complex legal system or a way of thinking about the law. It is not a single list of rules and punishments. It is not a single document. It is actively debated, and it has been actively debated for the almost 1,500 years that Islam has been around. It is constantly being developed. So judges in Iran must be trained in Sharia, but that does not mean that they necessarily all agree with each other. They have the same background in terms of a school of legal thought, but it doesn't mean that they all have the same opinions. And in fact, Iran's judicial system is somewhat notorious for often issuing conflicting decisions between lower level courts. The most important person in Iran's judiciary is the Chief Justice or the head of the judiciary. I'm using these terms interchangeably, and you'll sometimes hear head of the judiciary used to indicate that the Chief Justice has a bigger role than he does in, say, the United States Supreme Court. The Chief Justice is appointed by the Supreme Leader. This is one of the Supreme Leader's more important appointment powers. And in addition to presiding over Iran's Supreme Court, he also serves some other important functions. He gets to nominate half of the Guardian Council, again with the approval of the Majlis, and he also oversees the judicial system as a whole. Iran's highest court is known as the Supreme Court. It is Iran's highest court of appeal, but it does not have the power of judicial review. That is exercised by the Guardian Council instead. Finally, one last thing to note. Most of the legal cases in Iran happen in your standard sort of civil or criminal courts, but there's a different institution called revolutionary courts that still exercise some power and that are important, especially if you're concerned about rule of law and civil liberties. During the revolution and immediately after, the revolutionary government established these revolutionary courts to deal with opponents of the revolution, to deal with the remnants of Iran's monarchy. But the revolutionary courts stuck around and continued to have jurisdiction in certain cases that deal with matters of national security. And in particular, when there are major protests against the regime, protesters are sometimes tried in the revolutionary courts rather than in the standard criminal courts. And you might imagine that that's going to raise some concerns about due process and about the rights of the accused. Iran does have elections. I have some students every year who are surprised to hear that, but Iran has elections quite regularly. They're not necessarily free and fair in the sense that we've often used that term in this class, but people do actively participate, and the results are not 100% predictable. So the president of Iran is directly elected. There is a requirement that the president get a majority of popular of votes cast nationwide, and so there's a second round runoff if the president doesn't meet those criteria. For the Majlis, Iran has a unique and somewhat confusing mix of single and multi-member districts. There are, I think, 207 single-member districts in the country, and then the remaining 83 representatives are elected in some multi-member districts, mostly in the bigger cities. To win in a single-member district, depending on geography, you need a plurality of the vote, and you also need to get 25% of the votes cast in the first round of voting. In a multi-member district, system is a little bit different. Voters get to cast multiple votes, one per seat in the district. But in either case, if candidates don't meet that threshold in the first round, there are second round runoffs among the top candidates. They eliminate the lowest performing candidates, and they have a second round of voting among the top candidates. And so it's not uncommon for there to be a month or so between the first round of voting and the actual determination, the final determination of who's going to be in the Majlis in any given election cycle. Members of the Assembly of Experts are elected by a simple single-member district plurality system. That 25% threshold and the runoff round don't exist. Finally, important to note, and this we'll come back to this when we talk about political competition, the Guardian Council has the responsibility and the power to vet candidates, and that's a significant constraint on the competitiveness of all of these elections. Local governments in Iran is somewhat weak, not super important, but increasingly somewhat competitive. Iran formally is a unitary state. There is no protected power for subnational units of government. The provinces, which are called Ostan, have pretty limited autonomy. However, in 1997, a law was passed that created directly elected local councils to do the business of local governments in Iran. And these are actually a potential arena for political competition. The vetting for candidates is done by the Majlis, not the Guardian Council, and sometimes the Majlis is a little bit more permissive of candidates who question the existing power structure. So reformists can sometimes gain power, and if they do that, particularly in a major city, sometimes you'll see headlines saying, wow, this might portend more support for reformism in Iran. So not incredibly competitive, but they are an arena, or not incredibly powerful, I should say, but these are a potential arena for political competition in Iran. Finally, let's talk a little bit about Iran's military. There is a conventional army and navy and air force. I'm going to emphasize a subset of Iran's military called the Revolutionary Guard, but Iran has a bigger military than that. The Revolutionary Guard comprises maybe 25% of Iran's total military forces, but I'm going to focus on it here because it's the most politically influential. So the Revolutionary Guard, known in Farsi as the Sipah, is a paramilitary force originally created during the Iranian Revolution to comprise soldiers that are exceptionally loyal to the revolution as opposed to the old regime of the Shah. They increased drastically in numbers and also in their public prominence and approval during the Iran-Iraq War, which occupies much of the 1980s. They gain a lot of political power and also a whole lot of importance in the country's understanding of itself during that period. The Revolutionary Guard is directly controlled by the supreme leader. They are ultimately accountable to him, and they tend to be somewhat loyal to the supreme leader and to kind of jockey for his approval. It has significant economic assets. It controls the country's ports. Its members are often in a position to control smuggling, which is important in an environment where Iran faces lots of international economic sanctions. And so their economic assets give them a significant amount of clout. They're also active in foreign affairs. There is a subset of the Revolutionary Guard called the Quds Force, which is responsible for promoting Iran's agenda through training and through operations in foreign countries, for instance, by its sponsorship of the terrorist group Hezbollah in Lebanon. The Revolutionary Guard has become increasingly politically influential since the Iranian Revolution. Its leadership is not all unified. It's somewhat factionalized. There's a good deal of infighting. But high-ranking leaders in the Revolutionary Guard often also occupy other powerful positions, and their endorsement of a political candidate can be pretty important. So it's important to watch out for this organization because it, among other things, tends to be somewhat more conservative than the average Iranian politician and has the power or the influence to check sort of leftward movements in Iranian politics. One other subset of the Revolutionary Guard worth noting is the Basij. This is a volunteer militia under the control of the Revolutionary Guard. It's also created during the Iran-Iraq War, basically in response to the Supreme Leader's call for massive numbers of Iranian volunteers to fight against Iraq. And during that time, its volunteers are very enthusiastic, very ideologically motivated, and also very poorly trained and equipped. And they most famously participate in these massive human wave attacks, which are essentially suicide missions in the war against Iraq. The Basij today is no longer engaged in active fighting, but it remains really attractive to a lot of people who support the more theocratic elements of the regime. And it's also a vehicle for upward mobility for some people from poorer backgrounds because besieged members can sometimes get preferential access to a variety of services. So this is a relatively conservative political force. One aspect of the besieged that has attracted outside attention in recent years is that sometimes in some places, its members operate as a sort of morality police. Depending where you are, there's some geographic variation in this, but you might see besieged members deployed to enforce laws about things like mandatory head coverings and modest dress for women. You might see them disrupting public displays of affection among young people. You might see them, busting people for having illegal satellite dishes. So sometimes they operate to enforce the more socially conservative elements of Iranian law. They're also sometimes deployed to break up protests against the regime, so they can operate to defend the interests of the theocracy in that sense. All right, that's all the elements I need to talk to you about. So I'm going to leave you with just a bigger question to think about, which is the following. I find it really helpful to think about Iran's government as a democracy or a republican system in a theocratic box. But there's a lot of interplay, there's a lot of different exchanges, there's a lot of contested power relationships between the democratic and the theocratic elements of Iran's regime. And so I'll just close by suggesting that you might want to consider how those elements constrain each other in terms of their formal powers, and also we'll think about this when we get to political competition in terms of their informal powers. That's it. Thanks very much.